Hi everyone, I'm Spencer Barton, founder and executive programmer of Jazmin, and today we're going to be going over Jazmin and the use of APIs. Okay. So, what is an API? So, API stands for Application Programming Interface. And essentially, the purpose and what is an API is the API is the bridge between two different programs or applications. And the whole point of it is you can have two separate programs that might not be able to directly communicate with each other. And the API, through a language, allows them to communicate with each other and produce responses, requests, all that. So, like if you have a first program, you're producing a client request that's then sending it to the API. That API sends the client request translated to the server, and that server produces the response you were originally trying to get from your first program. So, first response, request, second program produces the response. Okay? Now, how does Jazmin use APIs in her program? So, one of the big issues in development of Jazmin was how we can use text-to-speech when she produces her statements that she outputs to the user, right? The way we did that is we were trying to figure out if we could produce a text-to-speech function, but the issue with that is the scalability, right? Massive function. Instead, we use an API, and the API is basically a super tiny function that instead sends it to a server to then communicate with the first program, being Jazmin, and produce an audio file from her original statement, right? And this also can go into her emotional complex and all that regulating stuff that she originally would use in her own program. It's just basically amplifying the scalability of Jazmin instead of creating this super tedious, probably disastrous bugging function herself. Okay? Now, here is an example from Jazmin's program that I wanted to go over. So up here at the top, we see API message. Hey Spencer, how are you? So that is going to be basically the foundation of this entire function. The function starts here. These are the parameters and everything that needs to be defined in order for this to work properly, okay? So the API message is, you can see it's right here, is the statement or the client request that the API is handling. And then the API URL, that little HTTPS link, is going to be the address that this API understands where it needs to go, okay? And the API key is the unique key specific to this API that allows that whole thing to work properly, basically its spot in the server, okay? The headers, we can initially see this is a JSON format application, okay? So it's going to convert basically Jazmin's statement to JSON format. That way the server can communicate with it and understand what's going on. The parameters, same kind of things going on here. These are unique to the API. In a short explanation, what these are doing is they're basically unique to Jazmin's speech, the generation of the audio file, all that. Like right here, you can see sample rate, output format. Okay, now getting into the gist of the API audio get function. So this is exactly what's taking all those headers, parameters, the message, and sending them to the server. Okay. So right here we see that it's using a post call to use the JSON parameters, use the headers, use the URL, and then we're making contact with the server. Okay. Here we're seeing it's confirming that it's getting success to the server, and now here are two very interesting lines of code. So what's happening is that this server is producing a URL path that has the MP3 file that Jazmin's going to grab right here, the get audio URL. She's grabbing it, right? And then she's going to open that audio file. She's going to open output.mp3, and then she's going to write to it, kind of getting access to it, right? And then using the play sound library, she's outputting that MP3 as she outputs, hey Spencer, how are you, to the user, okay? And then we're removing it, and something I want to point out here that's super unique is, why are we removing it? So this function is getting called every single time Jazmin talks, okay? So by removing the output.mp3 file, she's able to repeat this process as many times as she needs to, right? And then these two little, the else and except statement down here, these are just for debugging purposes. nothing else special to them, because in this whole process, it's really crucial that you format everything correctly, or you're gonna get a huge error code and she's not gonna be able to output that MP3 file. And it's all called here on this thread, all right? Okay. So what kind of API does Jazmin use? I know we didn't directly go over this in the presentation, but it's something I wanted to point out. So these types of APIs are architecture based, meaning they're like really like just kind of a vague type of what kind of API is. There's a million types of APIs that you can kind of reference, right? But what kind of API is it? I'm going to give you guys a second to kind of take a guess at what kind of API you think it is. Okay, so we know it's not a WebSocket API. Why? WebSocket APIs keep a constant connection between the API and the program, and it's constant. It's always there. Jazmin doesn't do that, okay? It's not a GraphQL API because it's not using a special queue to organize its structure. And it's definitely not a SOAP API because we're not using any XML messaging, okay? So thus, it's a REST API, and what a REST API is it's that kind of back and forth communication. So Jazmin talks to the API and the server, and then it comes back to her when she pleases. So it's only, like, that's why they use the word REST, is because it's only when it's called, right? Okay. Why are APIs so beneficial to a program? So APIs offer seamless integration, and they can really scale your program in ways that you might not have been able to before, like I was saying earlier, right? It saves time and development effort, enhances scalability. It does a million things that you couldn't before because you're essentially accessing greater amounts of code to use in your program, right? You can, like, we couldn't create a text-to-speech function ourselves as efficient as the one we use in the program. And it has all, and then we can use our own functions like emotions, tone, pitch into that API and scale it even more. So it's like an exponential relationship, okay? But in terms of the negative effects of using APIs, it's really important to point out that APIs are dependent on third-party services. So what I mean by that is an API is not your own code. It is not handled in your program. In the way, like yes, it's in your program, but when Jazmin sends that client request to the server, we're depending on that server to handle that request. We're depending on that server to respond to us with the MP3 file. And that sounds super simple until it's not, until you don't have a form of communication between the API in your program and the external server. If you lose that relationship, you lose the entire function. You're gonna, like, we get all sorts of errors, we get all sorts of issues. It just wouldn't work. You wouldn't get your MP3 file back, and Jazmin wouldn't end up talking. And on top of that, one thing we are still sorting out is the latency issues of that API, right? It takes a second for that external program to handle and run our parameters and then output our MP3 file. So even though it's super, like, it's negligible, it's important to point out. And then obviously costs and rate limits. APIs are not usually free in the sense of a higher powerful system. What I mean by that is there's plenty of free and accessible APIs out there that you're allowed to use, but they might not be as extensible as something like this API. So, and then there's rate limits. Like, APIs are not infinite. They are not dictated in your own program. They have bounds to them, right? So that's something really important to point out here. Thank you for your interest in Jazmin and listening to this talk on APIs. If you want to learn more details on Jazmin, go to jazminpy.com. And then if you have any questions for me, email me at spencer@jazminpy.com. And thank you for coming today. Thank you for your interest.